When you lose the person who made life worth living, sometimes the only answer is to disappear. Ellis Train was 58 when his wife died, and within months, everything else fell apart. Medical bills drained his savings, rent went unpaid, and the kindness of neighbors became too heavy to bear. One morning, he packed a single bag and walked into the forests of the Pacific Northwest, leaving his old life behind. Deep among the ancient redwoods, he found something extraordinary. A massive, hollowed giant over 20 feet wide, its trunk carved hollow by centuries of fire and time. Inside this cathedral of wood, he began building a home no one could imagine. Months passed in silence until a hiker's photograph went viral, and his estranged son saw it online. What happened when that son came searching would transform them both. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra and special for you. The apartment had become a tomb long before Ellis decided to leave it. He stood in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning in late September, watching steam rise from his coffee cup, and realized he hadn't spoken aloud in 4 days. The silence had a weight to it now, a physical presence that pressed against his chest and made breathing feel like work. Outside the window, the city of Portland continued its relentless rhythm, traffic humming, people rushing, life persisting with an indifference that felt almost cruel. Ellis was 58 years old, though he felt decades older. His hands, calloused and strong from 30 years of carpentry work, trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. He'd stopped shaving 2 weeks ago, stopped answering the phone 3 weeks before that. The voicemails piled up concerned neighbors, his wife's former colleagues, a few distant relatives who'd emerged from years of silence to offer condolences that felt more like obligations than comfort. Margaret had died on June 14th, 103 days ago. Ellis knew because he counted them, each morning adding another tally to the invisible ledger he kept in his mind. The cancer had taken 18 months from diagnosis to the end, though Ellis understood now that it had been stealing pieces of her long before that. The fatigue she'd blamed on getting older, the weight loss she'd attributed to stress, the persistent cough she'd dismissed as allergies. By the time they'd caught it, the disease had already claimed too much territory. He remembered the doctor's face when she delivered the prognosis. Professional sympathy, carefully practiced, revealing nothing of her own thoughts about the cruelty of a universe that would take a woman like Margaret, kind, thoughtful, still so full of plans at 63 years old. They'd fought it, of course. That's what you did. Chemotherapy that made her sick for days, radiation that burned her skin, clinical trials that promised hope and delivered exhaustion. Ellis had accompanied her to every appointment, held her hand through every treatment, and watched the woman he'd loved for 34 years slowly transform into someone he barely recognized. The medical bills had arrived like a slow-motion avalanche. Their insurance covered some of it, but the experimental treatments, the specialists, the medications that might buy another month or two, those costs fell on them. Ellis had worked through it all, taking extra jobs, weekend contracts, anything that would pay. Their savings, carefully built over decades, evaporated. The retirement fund they'd planned to use for travel drained away into co-pays and deductibles. Margaret had apologized for it near the end, her voice thin and papery. "We should have bought that RV when we had the chance." Ellis had told her not to worry about money. What else could he say? That he'd trade every dollar, every possession, every plan they'd ever made for just one more healthy year with her? She already knew that. They both did. When she died, Ellis had been sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand. It happened quietly, peacefully, the nurses said. Though Ellis wasn't sure peace was the right word, it felt more like an ending, abrupt and final, despite all the months of preparation. One moment she was breathing, shallow and labored, and the next she simply wasn't. The machines told him before his own senses did, their alarms cutting through the 3 a.m. silence of the oncology ward. The funeral had been small, Margaret had been specific about that in her final weeks. No big production, no reception with awkward small talk and casseroles. Just a simple service, cremation, and her ashes scattered in the coastal forest where they'd honeymooned decades ago. Ellis had followed her wishes exactly, moving through the arrangements with a mechanical precision that kept him from having to feel too much. Their son hadn't attended. That absence sat in Ellis's chest, like a stone, heavy and cold. Garrett had sent a text message 2 days before the service. "Can't make it. Work commitment I can't break. Sorry." 3 sentences to mark the death of his mother. No phone call, no follow-up. Just those few words, and then silence. Ellis tried not to judge. Garrett was 25 now, building a career as a civil engineer in Seattle, and their relationship had been strained for years. The distance had started in Garrett's teenage years, that common drift between fathers and sons, but it had widened considerably in the months before Margaret's diagnosis. Arguments about money, about Ellis's work choices, about priorities and responsibilities that seemed clear-cut to a young man who hadn't yet learned how complicated life actually became. The last real conversation they'd had, Ellis recalled, had been an argument about Margaret's care. Garrett had driven down from Seattle, walked into the house, and immediately started questioning every decision. Why? Weren't they trying this treatment? Why hadn't they gotten a second opinion sooner? Why was Ellis still taking carpentry jobs instead of being with her full-time? Because someone has to pay for all of this, Ellis had said, his patience finally breaking. Because insurance doesn't cover everything, and I can't just stop working and expect the bills to pay themselves. You should have had better insurance, Garrett had shot back. You should have saved more. You should have... I should have what? Ellis had stood up then, his voice rising. Seen the future? Known your mother would get sick? We did the best we could, Garrett. That's all anyone can do. Garrett had left that night and barely called after that. A few brief phone conversations, awkward and forced. Margaret had tried to mediate, to explain to Garrett that his father was doing everything possible, but the damage was done. When she died, the gap between them felt insurmountable. Now, standing in the kitchen of the Quincy apartment they could no longer afford, Ellis understood that part of Garrett's anger had come from fear and helplessness. Watching a parent die made you want to blame someone, and Ellis had been the available target. He understood it, but understanding didn't make the absence hurt any less. The eviction notice had arrived in August. Ellis had missed 3 months of rent, depleted what little remained in their account to cover Margaret's final medical bills. The landlord had been patient, sympathetic even, but patience had limits. Ellis had, until the end of September, to vacate. He'd started packing, going through 3 decades of accumulated life, trying to decide what mattered and what didn't. Margaret's clothes had been the hardest. He'd donated most of them to charity, but kept a few items: her favorite cardigan, the scarf she'd worn on their first date, a nightgown that still somehow held her scent. These he packed carefully in a box, along with photographs, her jewelry, some letters they'd written to each other over the years. The furniture would stay. Most of it wasn't worth moving, and Ellis had nowhere to move it to anyway. He'd contacted a few friends about storage, looked into cheap rentals, considered asking if anyone had a spare room, but each option felt wrong, like he was just postponing the inevitable collapse. The neighbors had been kind, almost aggressively so. Mrs. Chen from down the hall brought soup twice a week. The young couple in 4B offered to help with packing. The building superintendent waived the late fees and gave Ellis an extra week. Everyone meant well, and Ellis appreciated it. He truly did. But their kindness had become exhausting. Every concerned look, every gentle inquiry about how he was holding up, every offer of help required a response, a performance of coping that Ellis no longer had the energy to maintain. One evening in mid-September, unable to sleep, Ellis had gone walking. Not his usual route through the neighborhood, but out toward the edge of the city, where the streets gave way to green spaces and the urban noise faded. He'd walked for hours, until the sky began to lighten and he found himself standing at a trailhead, looking into the forest. Something had shifted in him at that moment. Not a sudden epiphany, but a quiet recognition that he didn't have to go back. He could just keep walking. The thought had startled him with its simplicity. Over the next week, that thought grew and took shape. Ellis began researching, carefully and methodically, as was his nature. He looked at maps of national forests, public lands, areas remote enough that a person could disappear if they wanted to. He read survival guides, watched videos about wilderness living, and made lists of supplies. He wasn't running away, he told himself. He was making a choice. The Pacific Northwest had always called to him. He and Margaret had honeymooned near the coast, spent weekends hiking through old-growth forests, talked about retiring somewhere they could see mountains and breathe clean air. They'd never gotten around to it. Now Margaret was gone, and Ellis had nothing tying him to the city except memories that hurt to revisit. His carpentry skills would serve him well in the wilderness. He knew how to build shelter, work with salvaged materials, solve problems with limited resources. He'd spent his career making something from nothing, and that skill seemed more valuable now than any amount of money. Ellis kept his plans private. He knew how it would sound if he tried to explain like grief-driven madness, like he was giving up or breaking down. Maybe he was, but it felt more like clarity than confusion, more like purpose than despair. On the last morning in the apartment, Ellis packed a single large backpack. Clothing, basic tools, a tarp, rope, water filtration tablets, a small camping stove. He added the box of Margaret's belongings, carefully wrapped. Her wedding ring, which he'd kept on a chain, around his neck since the funeral. The photograph from their honeymoon, both of them young and sunburned and happy. A recipe book she'd kept for 40 years, filled with handwritten notes and stains from countless meals. He left his phone on the kitchen counter, powered off. Wrote a brief note to the landlord, thanking him for his patience. Left another note for Mrs. Chen, asking her to please not worry. He didn't explain where he was going because he wasn't entirely sure himself. Just north, into the trees, until the noise of other people's lives faded completely. Ellis walked out of the apartment at dawn, the city still mostly asleep. His truck, an old Ford he'd owned for 15 years, sat in the parking lot. He'd considered selling it for the cash but decided to keep it a while longer. He drove north out of Portland, through increasingly rural landscapes, until he reached a trailhead he'd scouted the week before. The parking area was empty. Ellis took his pack, locked the truck, and hid the keys under the rear bumper. He might come back for it someday, or he might not. Either way, it would be here, waiting. The trail led up into dense forest, Douglas firs and western hemlocks rising like pillars into the morning mist. Ellis walked steadily, his carpenter's legs strong despite the months of grief and too little food. The pack was heavy but manageable. Each step took him further from the life he'd known and deeper into something unknown but strangely comforting. By afternoon, he'd left the marked trails behind, following deer paths and his own instincts. By evening, he was miles from any road, any building, any other human being. He made camp beside a creek, ate a simple meal from his supplies, and slept more soundly than he had in months. Over the following days, Ellis pushed deeper into the wilderness. He navigated by topographic maps he'd memorized, heading toward an area he'd identified as particularly remote old-growth forest that had never been logged, terrain too steep and broken for easy access, the kind of place where a man could vanish completely. On the 5th day, he found the tree. He'd been following a ridgeline, looking for a good place to establish a more permanent camp, when he entered a grove of ancient redwoods. These weren't the massive coastal giants, but they were old nonetheless, trees that had been standing when Lewis and Clark first explored this region. They rose from the forest floor like ancient monuments, their bark thick and fire-scarred, their canopy so dense it created a perpetual twilight at ground level. One tree stood apart from the others, larger and older. Ellis approached it slowly, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. As he got closer, he saw the opening, a split in the trunk at ground level, wide enough to walk through. He stepped closer and realized the entire center of the tree was hollow. Fire had done this, probably decades ago, maybe longer. Lightning strike or wildfire had burned out the tree's core, leaving only the outer shell of living wood. But the tree had survived, continued growing, its cambium layer thriving despite the massive wound at its heart. The hollow space inside was enormous, 20 feet across at the widest point, the charred walls rising up into darkness above. Ellis stepped inside and felt the world change around him. The air was different here, cooler and still, carrying the ancient smell of char and earth. Light filtered through the opening and through cracks in the upper trunk, creating shifting patterns on the floor. The space felt protected, almost sacred, a cathedral of wood and time. He stood in the center of that hollow and, for the first time since Margaret's death, felt something other than grief. Not happiness exactly, but potential. A sense that this emptiness could be filled with something new. Ellis set down his pack and began to truly see the space. The floor was surprisingly level, covered with centuries of accumulated duff and decomposed wood. The walls, though charred, were structurally sound. He could tap them and hear the solid wood beneath the char. The opening faced south, which would provide warmth and light. There was good drainage, evidence of weathering, but no standing water. It was perfect. That night, Ellis made camp inside the hollow tree for the first time. He cleared a space for his sleeping bag, built a small fire near the opening where the smoke could escape, and sat, looking out at the darkening forest. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine a future. Not the future he'd planned with Margaret that was gone, irretrievable, but a different future. One built with his own hands in this unlikely sanctuary. He would need time to build properly, to transform this hollow from shelter to home. But Ellis had time now. He had nothing but time. And he had skills that had been honed over 3 decades of carpentry work. He could do this. He would do this, as he sat by the small fire. Ellis pulled out the photograph of Margaret from their honeymoon. She was laughing in the picture, her hair wind-blown, the ocean visible behind her. He studied her face, memorizing it again, though he knew every detail by heart. "I found a place," he said quietly to the photograph, to her memory, to the silence. "I think you'd understand." The fire crackled. The forest breathed around him. And for the first time since she'd died, Ellis Train felt like he might survive after all. 3 months passed in the forest, and Ellis became someone new. Not entirely different, he was still the same man who'd walked away from Portland. But the silence had stripped away something he hadn't known he was carrying. The performance of normalcy, the need to appear functional for others. Out here, there was no one to perform for except himself and the trees. The hollow had transformed under his hands. Working methodically, Ellis had built a life inside the ancient redwood. He'd leveled the floor, constructed a bed frame, built storage shelves along the curved wall. A small wood stove, its chimney pipe running through a natural crack in the trunk. The opening fitted with a door made from salvaged planks, sealed with moss and mud. It wasn't much by conventional standards, but it was solid and warm. More importantly, it was built by his own skill, answering to no landlord. The simplicity felt like freedom. His days had fallen into rhythm. Wake at dawn, check the fire. Coffee from rationed supplies. Then work, always work. Gathering firewood, reinforcing walls, improving the shelter. Afternoons for foraging, checking snares, filtering water from the creek. Evenings for reading by firelight and carving small projects. The first shelf he'd built had been purely functional, storing food off the ground. But as he'd fitted the boards together, Ellis had felt something shift. This wasn't just survival carpentry, this was craft. The kind of work he'd always taken pride in. but had lost in the rush of production jobs. On a morning in late December, Ellis heard voices in the distance. His first instinct was to hide, but the voices sounded distressed. He stepped into view as a young man emerged from the trees, exhausted and disoriented. "Oh, thank God," the young man said. "I've been lost since yesterday. My phone died, and I've been walking in circles." Ellis studied him mid-20s, decent hiking gear, nothing suggesting serious wilderness experience. "You're far off any marked trail," Ellis said. "Where were you trying to go?" The young man, Bridger Knox, explained his solo backpacking trip gone wrong. Ellis couldn't send him back into the woods with darkness approaching. "I've got shelter nearby," Ellis said. "You can stay the night." When Bridger saw the hollow redwood and Ellis's door, exhaustion gave way to astonishment. "You live here?" "For now," Ellis said simply. Inside, Bridger took in the carefully constructed interior, the wood stove, shelves, workbench. "This is incredible. How long have you been building this?" 3 months, give or take." Ellis made tea, offered dried venison and apples. They sat on simple stools, and conversation flowed. Bridger was from Seattle, worked in tech, seeking himself after a breakup. Ellis mostly listened, keeping his story vague. He was grateful for company, but also wary. This was the first person to see his sanctuary. As evening fell, Bridger kept marveling at the tree. People would be amazed by this. Living in an actual hollow tree, it's like something out of a storybook. Something in his tone made Ellis uneasy. "Would you mind if I took pictures?" Bridger pulled out his phone, now charged. "Nothing with you in them, just the space." Ellis's instinct was to refuse, but Bridger's enthusiasm seemed genuine. What harm could a few photographs do? "Exterior only," Ellis said, "and you don't tell anyone where this is." "Of course, absolutely." They went outside and Bridger photographed the tree from different angles, the massive trunk, Ellis's door, the craftsmanship. In fading light, it did look striking. In the morning, Ellis gave Bridger directions back to marked trails and watched him disappear into the forest. The hollow felt emptier after, but Ellis told himself it was better this way. 2 weeks passed. Ellis noticed increased activity on distant trails, more hikers than usual for winter, some clearly searching for something specific. Dread formed in his stomach. On the 3rd day, he found a printed photograph near his water source. It showed his tree, his door, unmistakable. Below, somewhere in the Cascades, looking for this place. Ellis stood, holding the paper, understanding flooding through him. Bridger had shared the photographs, probably just posted them on social media, excited to share something unique. But people were now searching for Ellis's sanctuary. His privacy was ending. That evening, Ellis climbed to a ridge where he could get cell reception and powered on the old phone he'd kept buried. When it booted, notifications flooded in, most from unknown numbers, but several from his son. Ellis's hand shook as he opened Garrett's messages. The first few were from months ago, shortly after Ellis disappeared. "Dad, where are you? People are worried. Please call me." Then nothing for 2 months. Then 4 days ago, I saw a picture online. "Is that you? Are you living in a tree?" And yesterday, "I'm coming to find you." Ellis sat on that ridge as darkness fell, staring at those words. His son was coming. The world he'd walked away from was catching up. He turned off the phone and made his way back down in full darkness, navigating by memory and starlight. Inside his sanctuary, he built up the fire and sat watching flames, his mind turning over possibilities. Everything was about to change. The question was whether he'd run again or finally face what he'd been avoiding. By morning, Ellis had made his decision. He wouldn't run. Whatever came next, he would meet it here, in the home he'd built with his own hands. If Garrett was coming, then Ellis would wait. But first, he needed to prepare. Preparation was something Ellis understood. It was the language of carpentry: measure twice, cut once, think ahead, make sure the foundation is solid. He spent the day fortifying his camp, organizing supplies, trying to imagine what he'd say when Garrett arrived. The words wouldn't come. They'd been stuck too long, trapped behind years of distance and months of silence. As night fell, he sat by his fire and pulled out the photograph of Margaret. "He's coming," Ellis told her image. "Our boy is coming, and I don't know if he's angry or worried or just curious. But he's coming." The photograph offered no answers, but Ellis felt Margaret's presence anyway, gentle, understanding, encouraging him toward the hard conversation he'd been avoiding. Ellis would have to do it without her now, face his son alone, try to explain choices that barely made sense to himself, and hope that somewhere beneath the anger and confusion and years of distance, there was still something worth salvaging. The fire burned low, the forest settled into night sounds, and Ellis Train waited for the world to find him again. The morning after Ellis found the photograph, he stood outside the tree and looked at his sanctuary with new eyes. What had felt like refuge now felt exposed, vulnerable. The door he'd crafted with such care suddenly seemed like an invitation rather than a barrier. His first impulse was to pack up and move deeper into the wilderness. He could be gone in a day, disappeared again before Garrett or anyone else arrived. But even as he considered it, Ellis knew he wouldn't go. Something had shifted when he'd read those messages from his son. Still, he wasn't ready. Not yet. Ellis spent the day making the tree more secure. He built a second screen door, created hidden storage spaces for his most precious belongings, organized supplies so he could leave quickly if needed. As he worked, his mind kept returning to Garrett, to all the conversations they'd never had. The last real argument played over and over. Garrett's accusations had landed like blows because they'd contained truth. Ellis should have saved more, planned better, somehow anticipated that life would demand more than they'd prepared for. What Garrett didn't understand was that you did your best with what you knew at the time. You made choices based on available information and resources. And sometimes, it still wasn't enough. Ellis had worked himself nearly to exhaustion during Margaret's illness. He'd taken every job offered, pushed past reasonable limits. Not because he was careless with finances, but because medical care was crushingly expensive and their insurance had limits he'd never fully understood until they reached them. And through it all, Ellis had tried to shield Garrett from the worst, tried to maintain normalcy, suggest they had everything under control even as savings drained away. Maybe that had been a mistake, but Ellis had his pride. He was the father, supposed to provide and protect. Admitting he was drowning would have felt like failure. Late in the afternoon, Ellis found something he'd forgotten he'd brought. Tucked into his jacket pocket, folded small and worn soft, was a letter. He pulled it out slowly, recognizing his own handwriting on the envelope addressed to Garrett. He'd written it 3 months ago, in the apartment, 2 weeks before leaving. It had never been mailed. Ellis had started and abandoned a dozen versions before settling on this one, and even then he'd known it wasn't adequate. He sat and carefully unfolded the pages. His handwriting looked shaky, uncertain. The letter began with an apology, an attempt to explain his failures during Margaret's illness. He'd crossed out several lines, the pen pressing hard enough to tear the paper. The words spoke of fear and shame, of love he'd never been good at expressing aloud. One passage stood out: "I don't know what happens next for me. The apartment is gone. The savings are gone. Most of our life together is packed in boxes or given away. I feel unmoored, like a boat with no anchor. Margaret was my anchor for so long that I don't know how to be steady without her." Ellis refolded the letter carefully and tucked it back into his pocket. When Garrett came, maybe he'd share it. Or maybe they'd find better words in person. Either way, keeping it felt important. Over the next few days, Ellis noticed increasing signs of activity. Hikers passed through more frequently, some clearly searching rather than exploring. He stayed out of sight, watching from concealment. On the fourth day, he found a guest book, a spiral-bound notebook in a waterproof bag, placed on a rock near one of the trails. The first page read, "For visitors to this area and anyone searching for the tree home, please share your scene thoughts." Ellis stood, holding the notebook, torn between curiosity and dread. He shouldn't read it, but his hands were already opening the cover. The entries varied wildly. Some brief, just names and dates. Others longer, more personal. Many referenced the viral photograph. One entry stopped Ellis cold. "I lost my husband last year. Cancer. We'd planned to retire and travel. Then he got sick, and those plans disappeared. I've been so angry. Reading about the man who built a home in a tree, I realize grief doesn't have a right way or wrong way. We each survive it how we can. Maybe that man found his way to survive. I hope I can find mine. Thank you, whoever you are, for showing me it's possible to start over." Ellis had to sit down. This stranger understood something about his choice that he'd barely admitted to himself. He wasn't running from grief, he was trying to survive it. He flipped through more entries. Many expressed similar sentiments. People dealing with loss, transition, and upheaval. People who saw in his tree home a symbol of resilience. He'd never intended to inspire anyone, but somehow his private struggle had become public, and people were finding meaning in it. Then, near the back, Ellis found an entry that made his heart stop. "Dad, if you're reading this, I'm looking for you. I've been hiking these trails for days. Someone at the ranger station confirmed you're in this area. I'm not here to drag you back or tell you what to do. I just want to talk. Please. Your son." The entry was dated yesterday. Garrett was close. Maybe hours away, maybe less. Ellis closed the notebook and replaced it carefully. No more running. No more hiding. If Garrett was looking, Ellis would make himself findable. He spent the walk back composing opening lines. "I'm sorry," seemed too simple. "Let me explain," suggested there was rational explanation for disappearing. "I love you," had never been enough on its own. Maybe he'd just start with "hello." Inside the tree, Ellis began preparing with methodical care. He cleaned thoroughly, organized supplies, made sure he had enough food and water for 2 people. He pulled out Margaret's box and set it where Garrett would see it, evidence that Ellis hadn't abandoned everything. And he waited. The first night passed without any sign. Ellis sat by the fire, unable to sleep, listening to every sound. Dawn came without visitors. On the second night, exhaustion finally overtook anxiety. He woke to voices in the distance, hikers passing within 100 yards, but not seeing the well-hidden hollow. By the third day, Ellis found himself in suspended anticipation. He couldn't focus on work or settle into routines. He was trapped between hoping Garrett would arrive and dreading the confrontation. That afternoon, as Ellis sat outside carving wood, he heard purposeful footsteps, someone who knew where they were going. Ellis stood, heart hammering. Through the trees, he saw his son. Garrett looked older, beard grown, shoulders filled out. He stopped when he saw Ellis, and for a long moment neither moved. They just looked at each other across 20 feet of forest floor, across months of silence. Finally, Garrett spoke, voice hoarse and tired. "Dad." "Son," Ellis replied. "You found me. Come inside," Ellis said, gesturing toward the door. "You look like you could use some rest and a hot meal." Garrett followed him into the hollow, and Ellis watched his son's face as he took in the interior, the careful construction, the workbench, the shelves along the curved wall, the small wood stove radiating warmth. He saw surprise there, and something else. Respect, maybe. Recognition that this wasn't the shelter of someone who'd given up. "This is incredible," Garrett said quietly, running his hand along one of the shelves. "The joinery, the way you've adapted to the curved walls, it's really impressive, Dad." Ellis busied himself making tea, giving them both something to do with their hands while they figured out how to begin. He pulled out dried venison, some forage greens he'd prepared, bread he'd baked in his small camp oven. Simple food, but honest. They sat across from each other on the stools Ellis had built, and for a long moment there was only the sound of the fire crackling and the forest breathing outside. "I'm sorry, I didn't come to the funeral," Garrett said finally, the words coming out rushed. "I should have been there. There's no excuse for that." Ellis looked up, surprised by the directness. "You had your reasons." "I was angry. At you, at the situation, at everything. And I was scared. I didn't know how to watch you grieve, didn't know how to handle my own grief and yours at the same time." He paused, meeting his father's eyes. "But that's not an excuse. Mum deserved better. You deserved better." "Your mother understood," Ellis said quietly. "She knew you loved her. That was enough for her." Garrett's face tightened with emotion he was clearly trying to control. "Did she? I wasn't sure. After that last fight we had, when I said all those things about money and priorities and how you should have handled things differently." He stopped, shook his head. "I was such an idiot. Acting like I knew better. Like I could have done everything perfectly if I'd been in your position." "You were scared too," Ellis said gently. "Watching someone you love die makes you want to blame someone, fix something, find a reason for why it's happening. I understood that, even when your words hurt." They sat in silence again, the honesty hanging between them like something fragile and precious. "Why did you leave?" Garrett asked. "Why not call me? I would have helped. I would have, I don't know, tried to be there for you." "Would you?" Ellis asked, not unkindly. "After everything that happened between us? After the funeral you didn't attend? I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me, and I didn't think I had the strength to find out." Garrett flinched as if struck. "That's fair. But Dad, disappearing like that, people were worried. Mrs. Chen called me crying. The landlord didn't know what to do with your stuff. Some of your old work friends tracked me down asking if you were okay. Nobody knew where you were or if you were even alive." "I know, and I'm sorry for that." Ellis stared into his tea. "But I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore, couldn't keep walking the same streets, seeing the same places your mother and I used to go together, the coffee shop where we had breakfast every Sunday, the park where we used to walk. Everything reminded me of her, every single thing. So you just left, built a house in a tree?" Ellis almost smiled at the incredulity in his son's voice. "I didn't plan it. Exactly. I just started walking one day and kept going until I felt like I could breathe again. The tree," he gestured at the hollow walls around them. "I found it and it felt right, like maybe I could build something here. Not the life I had before, but something new." When exhaustion finally claimed them both that first night, Garrett unrolled his sleeping bag on the floor and Ellis settled into his bed frame. The hollow was warm and quiet, the fire burning low. Just before sleep, Ellis heard Garrett's voice in the darkness. "I'm glad you're alive, Dad. I'm glad I found you." "I'm glad too," Ellis said softly. The next morning, Ellis woke to find Garrett already up, examining the shelves Ellis had built along the curved wall. His son ran his hand over the smooth wood, testing the joints with the practiced eye of an engineer. "You always did good work," Garrett said without turning around. "I remember watching you in the garage when I was a kid. The way you'd measure everything twice, take your time getting each cut exactly right." "Rushing leads to mistakes," Ellis said, the old carpentry wisdom coming automatically. "You taught me that." Garrett finally turned to face him. "You taught me a lot of things I didn't appreciate at the time. Patience, precision, the value of doing something well, even if no one else sees it." Ellis started a fire and made coffee from his carefully rationed supplies. They ate breakfast in comfortable quiet, and Ellis felt something he hadn't felt in months, a sense of normalcy, of shared routine. It reminded him of weekend mornings when Garrett was young, before the distance had grown between them, when they'd worked together on small projects in the garage. After breakfast, Garrett helped Ellis gather firewood. As they worked side by side, Garrett talked about his life in ways he never had before. His job as a civil engineer, the challenges of his current projects, a bridge renovation that had more problems than the initial survey had revealed. His recent promotion to senior engineer. He mentioned a woman named Andrea, his fiancée, and Ellis heard pride and affection in his son's voice when he spoke her name. "I'd like to meet her," Ellis said carefully, setting down an Andrea-biz armload of wood. "If you'd want that." Garrett stopped, a piece of wood in his hands. "Really? You'd want to meet her?" "Of course. She's important to you. That makes her important to me. I wasn't sure you'd—" Garrett set down the wood. "After you left, I thought maybe you didn't want to be part of my life anymore. That you were done with all of it. With me." The words hit Ellis like a physical blow. He sat heavily on a fallen log, trying to process what his son had just said. "No, God, no, Garrett. That's not why I left at all." "Then why?" Ellis took a breath, searching for the right words. "I was drowning. Every day in that apartment felt like I was underwater, unable to breathe. The memories, the bills, the well-meaning neighbors constantly asking how I was holding up. It was all too much. I needed silence, space, a place where I could just exist without having to explain myself or perform being okay when I wasn't. You could have told me that. I would have understood. Could I? We hadn't really talked in months. Not honestly, anyway." Ellis looked directly at his son. "I thought I was protecting you by handling everything alone. I see now that was wrong. That it just made the distance between us worse." They worked in silence for a while, carrying wood back to the tree. The physical labor felt good, gave them both something to focus on while processing the weight of their words. Later that afternoon, Garrett pulled out his phone and showed Ellis the viral photograph that had led him here. "This is how I found you. It's been shared thousands of times." Ellis looked at the image of his tree, his door, captured in beautiful afternoon light. Then Garrett scrolled through the comments, and Ellis read messages from strangers. Words about loss and healing, about finding courage to start over, about how grief didn't have to mean the end of everything. "You've inspired people, Dad," Garrett said quietly. "Without even meaning to, people see what you've built here, and it gives them hope that they can rebuild their own lives too." Ellis handed back the phone, uncomfortable with the attention, but also genuinely moved by the sincerity of the messages. He'd never thought of himself as inspirational. He'd just been trying to survive one day at a time. That evening, back at the tree, Ellis retrieved Margaret's recipe book from the box of her belongings. The pages were water-stained but readable, filled with her handwriting and notes in the margins. "Can I see it?" Garrett asked, and Ellis handed it to him carefully. Garrett opened it slowly, reverently, and Ellis watched his son's face as he saw his mother's writing again. Garrett turned pages, stopping at certain recipes, his finger tracing her notes. "I remember this one," he said, voice thick with emotion. "She made it every Thanksgiving. The whole house would smell like sage and butter. And this—" Ellis pointed to a chocolate cake recipe. "She made it for all your birthdays until you decided you were too old for homemade cake. I was 16 and stupid." Garrett's laugh was quiet and sad. "God, I wish I could take that back. Tell her I was sorry for being such a brat about it." They spent the evening looking through the book together, each recipe a doorway to memory. Margaret's notes brought her presence into the small space, Ellis's favorite. "Garrett loves this. Perfect for Sunday dinner." For a few hours, it felt like she was there with them. "Do you think we could make one of her recipes?" Garrett asked. "Here, I mean, with what you have." They chose a simple stew that could be adapted to Ellis's limited supplies. Working together in the small space, they prepared the meal, following Margaret's instructions as closely as possible. It wasn't perfect. Some ingredients had to be substituted, and Ellis's camp stove was temperamental, but the process felt sacred, a way of keeping Margaret present, honoring her memory through the simple act of cooking her food. When they finally ate, the stew was good, close enough to the original to evoke the taste of home, of Sunday dinners around the kitchen table, of a life that felt impossibly distant now. She'd be happy about this, Garrett said, setting down his bowl. Us cooking together, actually talking instead of just circling around everything we're afraid to say. She worried about the distance between us, Ellis admitted, especially toward the end. She made me promise I'd try to fix things with you, but I didn't know how. I still don't. Really, I'm just trying. That's enough, Garrett said. Trying is enough. As night fell, they sat by the fire, and Garrett told Ellis about the wedding he was planning. Small ceremony in the spring, just Andrea's family and a few close friends. Nothing elaborate. Andrea wasn't interested in a big production, and neither was he. I want you there, Dad, Garrett said, walking me down the aisle, or however that works when it's two guys. I want you to meet Andrea. I want you to be part of this. Ellis felt his throat tighten with emotion. I'd be honored. Truly. They talked late into the night, years of silence finally breaking open. When sleep came, Garrett settled into his sleeping bag on the floor. I'm glad I found you, Dad, Garrett said into the darkness. I'm glad too, son, Ellis replied, and meant it with his whole heart. The first snow arrived 3 days after Garrett found Ellis, transforming the forest into a cathedral of silence. Ellis woke to find the world outside softened and muted, every branch and needle dressed in white. Inside the hollow tree, warmth from the wood stove created a pocket of comfort against the cold. Garrett had stayed longer than either of them had planned. What was supposed to be a single night had stretched into nearly a week. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, gathering wood together, preparing meals, talking about everything and nothing. The years of distance were still there, a gap neither could ignore, but they were finding ways to bridge it, one careful conversation at a time. On the morning after the snow, Ellis sat by the fire, working on a project he'd started weeks ago. He'd been carving a chess set from pieces of fallen wood, each piece slowly taking shape under his knife. The work was meditative, something to occupy his hands during long evenings alone. Garrett watched him work, steam rising from his coffee cup. Is that a chess piece? Queen, Ellis said, holding up the partially carved figure. He'd been trying to capture something of Margaret in the piece, the tilt of her head, the way she'd smiled. It wasn't quite right yet, but he was getting closer. You're making a whole set? Ellis nodded toward a cloth bundle on the shelf. Been working on it since November. Gives me something to do with my hands when the nights get long. Garrett walked over and carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside were completed pieces, pawns, rooks, knights, a king. Each one, carved with care, sanded smooth, showing the grain of different woods. He picked up the king piece, examining it closely. This is beautiful work, Dad. Really beautiful. He looked up. You used to have that old chess set, remember? The one Grandpa gave you? Still have it. Packed away somewhere back in storage. Ellis set down his knife. You and I used to play on rainy afternoons when you were young. You got pretty good at it. You always let me win, Garrett said with a slight smile. Only at first. By the time you were 12, you were beating me fair and square. Ellis picked up another piece of wood, studying it. You had a natural talent for thinking 3 moves ahead. Could see patterns I missed. Garrett was quiet for a moment, turning the king piece in his hands. I miss those afternoons, before everything got complicated between us, when it was just us and a chessboard and nothing else mattered. Me too, Ellis admitted softly. They spent the morning working side by side. Ellis continued carving while Garrett sketched in a small notebook he'd brought, working on designs for his bridge project. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with all the things they were afraid to say. Around midday, they heard footsteps approaching through the snow. Ellis tensed instinctively, but Garrett stood and moved to the door. It's probably just a hiker, he said. People have been passing through pretty regularly since that photo went viral. But when the door opened, it wasn't a casual hiker. A woman in ranger uniform stood outside, her expression friendly but unmistakably official. She was somewhere in her 50s, with greying hair pulled back in a practical braid and the weathered face of someone who spent most of their time outdoors. "Mr. Train," she said, looking directly at Ellis. "I'm Beverly Strand, park ranger for this district. Mind if I come in for a minute?" Ellis's stomach tightened. This was what he'd been afraid of since. Bridger's photograph had gone viral official attention. Questions about permits and regulations. Someone with authority telling him he had to leave. "Of course," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Beverly stepped inside, stomping snow from her boots. She looked around the interior with obvious interest, taking in the construction, the wood stove, the careful organization of Ellis's small living space. "This is impressive," she said genuinely. "Really impressive. You built all this yourself?" "Yes, ma'am." "How long have you been living here?" "About 3 months now." Beverly nodded, pulling out a small notebook. "I'm going to be straight with you, Mr. Train. Technically, what you're doing here isn't entirely legal. This is protected forest land, and establishing permanent residence requires permits we don't typically issue to individuals." Ellis felt his chest constrict. He'd known this might happen eventually, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real and immediate. "However," Beverly continued, her tone softening slightly, "you're not causing any environmental damage that I can see. You're managing waste properly, not cutting live trees, being respectful of the land and wildlife. And honestly, given the circumstances," she glanced at Garrett, "your son explained some of your situation when he contacted the ranger station last week looking for you." Garrett had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I wanted to make sure I was searching in the right area. Beverly was helpful in pointing me in the right direction." Beverly's expression softened further. "Look, I'm not here to kick you out, Mr. Train, but I do need to establish some ground rules. First, I need you to agree to monthly check-ins with me or another ranger, just so we know you're alive and well out here. Second, if your presence here starts causing problems, environmental damage, conflicts with wildlife, anything like that, you'll need to relocate. Can you agree to those terms?" Ellis felt something loosen in his chest, the tight knot of anxiety beginning to unwind. "Yes, absolutely, I can agree to that." "Good." Beverly made a note in her book. "I'll also ask that you keep the exact location of this tree as private as possible. Your viral fame is bringing a lot of curious hikers into the area, and some of them aren't as respectful of the wilderness as they should be. We've had reports of people leaving trash, wandering off trails, disturbing wildlife habitats." "I never intended for the photographs to go public," Ellis said. "The hiker who took them promised to keep the location private." "I know, these things happen in the age of social media." Beverly closed her notebook and looked around the hollow one more time. "For what it's worth, I think what you've built here is remarkable. It takes real skill and determination to create something like this. Just be careful, okay? Winter in these mountains can be brutal, especially for someone living alone." "I will. Thank you for understanding." After Beverly left, Ellis sat heavily on his stool, processing what had just happened. He'd been granted permission to stay, at least conditionally. The relief was overwhelming, almost making him lightheaded. "She seemed nice," Garrett observed. "She could have made things very difficult," Ellis replied. "Could have called in other officials, forced me to leave immediately. I'm grateful she didn't." That afternoon, as they worked together on clearing snow from around the entrance to the tree, Beverly's visit prompted deeper conversation. Garrett asked about Ellis's plans. Did he intend to stay here permanently? What would he do when his supplies ran low? Had he thought about what winter's full impact would mean? Ellis admitted he hadn't thought much beyond surviving each day. The tree had been refuge, not a carefully considered long-term plan. "You could come back to the city," Garrett suggested carefully. "Not to Portland necessarily, but Seattle, maybe. I could help you find a place, get back on your feet financially." "I'm not ready for that," Ellis said honestly. "Not yet, but eventually?" Ellis stopped working and looked at his son directly. "Eventually, maybe. I don't want to live in the forest forever, Garrett, but I needed this time. I still need it, I think. To figure out who I am without your mother. To learn how to be alone without feeling like I'm drowning every moment. Garrett nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. I can accept that. But you're not completely alone anymore, right? I mean, I'm here, and I'm not planning to just disappear from your life again. No? No. Garrett's voice was firm, carrying a conviction that Ellis hadn't heard from him in years. I want to be part of your life, Dad. However that looks going forward. Whether you're living in a tree or an apartment or wherever you end up, I want us to fix what's broken between us. That evening, Ellis finished carving the queen piece of his chess. He held it up to the firelight, studying the lines of the face he'd worked so hard to capture. It still wasn't perfect, it could never truly capture Margaret, but it was close enough to remember, to honor, to carry forward. It looks like her, Garrett said softly, looking over his shoulder. Around the eyes especially. You got that right. Ellis wrapped the piece carefully and added it to the growing collection. The set was nearly complete now. Just a few more pawns and it would be finished. Want to play? He asked Garrett. We could use what's done so far, make do with what we have. They set up an improvised board on a flat piece of wood, arranging the completed pieces in their starting positions. As they played, moving carved figures across makeshift squares, Ellis felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Not for everything to go back to how it was that was impossible, and he knew it, but hope that something new could be built from what remained. That the pieces of his broken life could be arranged into a different pattern, one that still held meaning and purpose and connection. Garrett won the game, just as he had when he was 12 years old. And Ellis smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in months. Midwinter settled over the forest with sacred silence. Garrett had returned to Seattle after 10 days, leaving behind a promise to return in 2 weeks and a sense of connection Ellis hadn't felt in years. The hollow tree felt different now, less like a hiding place and more like home. Ellis fell back into his routines, but they'd changed subtly. He found himself planning for Garrett's next visit, gathering extra firewood, organizing the space, attempting to bake bread using Margaret's recipe that Garrett had loved. On a clear afternoon, Ellis sat outside studying a photograph he'd kept in his wallet for decades. It showed him, Margaret, and 12-year-old Garrett at a lake in eastern Oregon. Their last real family vacation before everything shifted. They'd rented a small cabin for a week that summer. No television, no distractions. Ellis remembered teaching Garrett to fish, Margaret reading on the porch, evenings around a campfire laughing until their sides hurt. That was the summer before Garrett had become a teenager and pulled away, before work consumed too much of Ellis's time, before the slow drift that had eventually become a canyon between them. In the photograph, they all looked so happy, so unaware of how complicated everything would become. Margaret's arm was around Garrett's shoulders. Even in the faded image, Ellis could see the love in her face, the joy in Garrett's young eyes. I wish you could see him now, Ellis said quietly to the photograph. He's grown into such a good man. You'd be so proud. The forest absorbed his words, just whined through branches and the distant call of a raven. Later that week, a young hiker appeared, stumbling through snow with an injured ankle. Ellis heard him calling for help. The man, Kip Tenner, was in his early 20s, clearly unprepared for winter hiking. I slipped on ice about a mile back, Kip explained through gritted teeth. Heard there might be someone living out here who could help. Ellis helped him inside and examined the ankle, badly sprained but not broken. He bound it tightly, elevated it, gave Kip water and food, and suggested he stay off it for a day or two. You're really living in a tree, Kip said, looking around with wonder. Why? Long story, Ellis said. I've got time, not going anywhere with this ankle. Over 3 days, While Kip healed and a winter storm raged outside, Ellis found himself telling parts of his story. In turn, Kip talked about his own struggles. He'd graduated with crushing debt. His father kept pressuring him to join the family business, but Kip wanted something different. They'd fought constantly until Kip stopped answering his father's calls 3 months ago. "He probably thinks I'm a failure," Kip said on the second evening, "throwing away opportunities, being ungrateful." Ellis recognized the pain in the young man's voice. "Or he's worried about you and doesn't know how to say it without it coming out as criticism." "You think? Parents aren't perfect," Ellis said carefully. "We want what's best for our children, but sometimes we're so focused on what we think that should look like that we forget to ask what they actually want. And when there's distance, it's easy to fill it with assumptions instead of conversation." Kip was quiet. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am." "Did you fix it?" Ellis thought about Garrett's visit, their conversations, the tentative bridge they were building. "I'm trying to. We both are. It's not fixed yet. Maybe never will be completely. But we're talking now. That's more than before." "Think I should call my dad?" "I think that's up to you," Ellis said. "But if you want my opinion, don't wait as long as I did. Distance has a way of becoming permanent if you let it." On the third day, the storm cleared, and Kip's ankle had improved enough to travel. Before leaving, he wrote in a notebook, tore out the page, and handed it to Ellis. "My dad's name and number. If I don't call him within the next week, would you maybe call him yourself? Tell him I'm okay." Ellis took the paper and tucked it away. "I hope you'll make that call yourself." "Yeah, me too. Thank you for everything." Ellis watched him disappear into the trees, moving slowly but steadily. He hoped the young man would make that call. Hoped he wouldn't wait until it was almost too late. That evening, Ellis pulled out the letter he'd written to Garrett months ago, the one he'd never sent. He read it again, saw all the inadequate attempts to explain himself, all the apologies that didn't quite reach far enough. He'd never given Garrett this letter. They'd talked instead, found better words in person, but the letter still meant something. It represented his desire to reach out, even when he hadn't followed through. Ellis carefully folded the letter and placed it back in his jacket, next to the paper with Kip's father's information. 2 fathers, 2 sons, 2 stories of distance and the hard work of closing that gap. The next morning, footsteps approached. Ellis's heart leaped. Was Garrett back early? But when he opened the door, he found Beverly instead. "Monthly check-in," she said cheerfully. "How are you holding up?" "Better than expected. The tree stays warm even in the worst weather." Beverly examined the exterior, checking for problems. Finding none, she made notes. "I heard you helped a hiker with an injured ankle last week. Word gets around. He needed help." "You're becoming something of a legend out here," Beverly said. "The hermit who helps lost hikers, lives in harmony with nature. People are starting to make pilgrimages, hoping to meet you." Ellis wasn't sure how he felt about that. "I just wanted to be left alone. I know, but sometimes what we need and what we get are different things." Beverly smiled. "For what it's worth, I think you're handling it well. You could be bitter about the loss of privacy, but instead you're helping people. That says something about your character." After Beverly left, Ellis sat with her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe his isolation had never been meant to be permanent. Maybe it was just a necessary pause, a chance to heal before re-entering the world in some new way. He thought about Garrett coming back in a week, about meeting Andrea, about the wedding in spring, about all the small connections beginning to form again, threads reaching out from his self-imposed exile. Margaret would have liked this, he thought. Not the isolation itself, but the rebuilding. She'd always believed in second chances, in starting over without forgetting where you came from. Ellis picked up his carving knife and the last unfinished pawn from his chess set. Time to complete what he'd started. Time to finish building something beautiful from the pieces he had left. Spring came early to the forest. Ellis had survived the winter, proving to himself that he could endure, that grief didn't have to mean the end of everything. Garrett had visited twice more, each visit easier than the last. Plans were forming for Ellis to attend the wedding in May, to finally meet Andrea, to step back into his son's life. On a warm afternoon in late March, Ellis was sorting through the box of Margaret's belongings. He'd avoided going through it thoroughly, taking out only the recipe book and photographs. But something prompted him that day to look deeper. He pulled out her jewelry box, her favorite scarf, the nightgown that had lost her scent. At the bottom, beneath everything else, he found a small wooden container he didn't recognize. Ellis opened it carefully. Inside was a medical alert bracelet. He turned it over, reading the engraved information. Margaret's name, her blood type, and a date that made his stomach drop. The date was 6 months before she'd told him about the cancer. His hands shaking, Ellis dug deeper. He found a manila envelope wedged along the side. Medical documents, test results, consultation notes, all dated months before Margaret had told him she was sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, metastatic, poor prognosis. The date on the first oncology report was 8 months before she'd told him, not 6 months, 8. Ellis set down the papers and pressed his hands to his face. She'd known. She'd known for 8 months and hadn't told him. Had gone through initial consultations, gotten second opinions, made decisions about her treatment without him. Why? Why would she hide something like that? He forced himself to keep reading. Deeper in the stack, he found letters, not from doctors, but from Margaret herself. The first was addressed to Garrett, dated 2 months before she died. Asterisk, my dearest Garrett. Asterisk, asterisk. If you're reading this, I need you to know something your father doesn't. I kept my diagnosis from him for as long as I could. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I knew what it would do to him. I knew he'd sacrifice everything to try to save me, and I couldn't bear watching him destroy himself for a battle I knew we couldn't win. Asterisk, asterisk. The doctors were clear from the beginning. This type of cancer, this far advanced treatment might buy months, but not years. I chose to have those months on my terms, without the panic that would have consumed us if your father had known from the start. Asterisk, asterisk. I handled the initial consultations alone. When I finally told your father, I gave him a version of the truth that allowed him to feel like he was helping. But the fight was already lost. I just wanted him to feel like he'd done everything he could. Asterisk, asterisk. Please, don't be angry with him for the financial struggles. The treatment costs weren't his fault. I chose the most expensive options because I wanted every possible day with you both. I told him they were necessary. I let him believe we still had a chance. Asterisk, asterisk. Don't blame him for not knowing sooner. I hid it deliberately. I protected him the only way I knew how. Asterisk, asterisk. Take care of your father when I'm gone. He'll need you, even if he doesn't know how to ask. Asterisk, asterisk. All my love. Mom. Times. Ellis sat frozen. Everything he'd believed about those final months, the timeline, the decisions, the desperate scramble for treatment, all of it had been built on Margaret's carefully constructed deception. She'd protected him. That's what she'd thought she was doing. But in protecting him, she'd also set in motion everything that followed. Garrett's anger about the finances made sense now. Had Garrett received this letter? Had he known the truth all along? Ellis searched through the remaining papers and found another letter. One addressed to him, sealed in an envelope with his name in Margaret's handwriting. His hands shook as he opened it. Asterisk, my dearest Ellis. Asterisk, asterisk, I'm writing this 3 weeks before I plan to tell you about the cancer, and I know what you're thinking. Why did I wait? Why didn't I tell you immediately? Asterisk, asterisk. Because I love you. Because I know you. Because if I'd told you the truth from the beginning, that this cancer was terminal, that treatment was about buying time, not curing disease, you would have fallen apart. And I needed you to be strong for me. Asterisk, asterisk. I'm sorry for the financial burden. I'm sorry for the expensive treatments I insisted on, knowing they probably wouldn't work. I'm sorry for letting you believe we had more of a chance than we did, but I'm not sorry for protecting you from the complete hopelessness I felt. Asterisk, asterisk. I wanted every possible moment with you and Garrett. I wanted to fight, even if the fight was futile. And I needed you to fight alongside me, believing we might win. Asterisk, asterisk. Forgive me for the secrets. Forgive me for the debt. Forgive me for leaving you with less than you deserved. Asterisk, asterisk. You were the love of my life. Every moment with you was a gift. Asterisk, asterisk. Please don't let this destroy you. Please find a way to live and be happy again. Please reconnect with Garrett. Asterisk, asterisk. All my love, forever. Margaret Times Ellis sat as the afternoon light faded, surrounded by evidence of his wife's deception, well-intentioned, born of love, but a deception nonetheless. She'd made choices for both of them, had controlled the narrative of her illness, and Garrett had been meant to know. The letter was written to him, explaining everything. If he'd received it, then his anger at Ellis made sense. He'd thought Ellis was negligent, when really Ellis had been deceived. Or maybe Garrett had never received the letter. Ellis needed to know. He needed to understand what Garrett knew, and when he'd known it. He needed to share this discovery, to rewrite the story they'd both been telling themselves. He carefully gathered the documents, the letters, the medical bracelet, evidence of a truth he'd never suspected. Ellis pulled out his phone and sent a message to Garrett. Asterisk. When you come this weekend, I need to show you something. Something about your mother. Something that changes everything we thought we knew. Asterisk. The response came quickly. Asterisk. Everything okay? Asterisk. Asterisk. I don't know yet, but we need to talk. Asterisk, asterisk. I'll be there Friday afternoon. Asterisk. Ellis set down the phone and looked at the letters again, at Margaret's careful handwriting, at the secrets she'd kept trying to protect the people she loved. I understand why you did it, he said quietly to her memory, but it cost us more than you knew. The forest offered no answers, just wind and the first brave birdsong of evening. Ellis sat with the truth of his wife's hidden illness and the complicated mess of love and lies that had shaped everything that came after. Tomorrow, he would prepare for Garrett's arrival. Tomorrow, he would figure out how to explain this. Tomorrow, he would begin rebuilding their understanding of the past. But tonight, he would sit with the truth and let it settle into his bones. Friday arrived with perfect spring weather that felt almost mocking. Ellis had barely slept, his mind churning through how to present what he'd discovered to Garrett. He'd spent the morning preparing. He'd laid out all the documents on his workbench, the medical bracelet, the test results, the letters, evidence arranged like pieces of a puzzle. The chess set sat completed now on a shelf, all the pieces finally carved and sanded smooth. Ellis had finished the last pawn 2 nights ago. The set felt symbolic, something broken made whole again. He'd also created a sign, hand-lettered on smooth wood. Garrett, I'm here, your father. He'd posted it on the trail, an open invitation, a declaration that he was no longer hiding. Now he sat outside, holding a letter he'd written himself over the past 2 days. Asterisk, dear Garrett, asterisk, asterisk. By the time you read this, I'll have shown you your mother's letters and medical documents. But I wanted to put my own thoughts on paper. Asterisk, asterisk. For months, I've carried guilt about your mother's illness. I believed I should have seen the signs earlier, should have been more prepared. I thought her death was partly my failure. Asterisk, asterisk. Now I know that's not the whole truth. Your mother made choices I never knew about. She controlled information, decided what I would and wouldn't know. She did it out of love, I understand that. But it changes everything. Asterisk, asterisk. I need you to tell me if you received the letter she wrote to you. I need to know if you've been carrying this knowledge all along. Because if you knew, then our entire conflict has been built on a foundation I couldn't see. Asterisk, asterisk. I'm not angry at your mother, just sad. Sad that she felt she had to protect me like that. Sad that her protection led to so much misunderstanding between us. Asterisk, asterisk. But I'm also grateful. We have a chance now to rebuild on actual truth instead of assumptions. Asterisk, asterisk, I love you. I should say that more. Asterisk, asterisk, your father times Ellis folded the letter. Multiple generations attempting to communicate across gaps created by love and fear. Around noon, Beverly appeared. Not here for a check-in, she said. Just wanted to give you a heads up. Your son called the station this morning. Said he's bringing someone, his fiancée. Wanted directions. Ellis's stomach flipped. Andrea was coming. Not on the day he'd expected. Not on the day he had to reveal Margaret's secrets. I gave him better directions, Beverly continued. He should be here within the hour. She studied his face. You okay? Just a lot happening today. Family stuff is never easy, for what it's worth. I think you're doing good work here. Not just the building, but the relationship repair. That takes courage. After she left, Ellis tried to calm his thoughts. He practiced what he'd say, but every phrase sounded inadequate. Finally, he heard voices. Two people. Ellis stood and waited. Garrett appeared first, looking relaxed and happy. Behind him came a woman in her late 20s, petite, dark-haired, with an open, friendly face. Dad, Garrett said warmly. This is Andrea. Andrea, my father. Ellis. Andrea stepped forward and extended her hand. Mr. Train, it's wonderful to finally meet you. Ellis shook her hand. Please, call me Ellis. Welcome. Your home is amazing, Andrea said, looking at the hollow tree with genuine awe. May I see inside? Ellis showed them in. Andrea, delighted in the craftsmanship, asked questions about how he'd built various features. She was kind, intelligent, clearly loved Garrett. Ellis would have been thrilled to meet her under different circumstances, but the documents on his workbench pulsed with urgency. Garrett noticed them immediately. Is this what you needed to show me? He asked. Yes, Ellis said. But maybe Andrea... Would you mind if Garrett and I talked privately for a bit? Andrea's face showed understanding. Of course. Garrett gave her directions to a nearby viewpoint, kissed her cheek, and watched her disappear. Then he turned to Ellis, expression shifting to concerned. What's going on, Dad? Ellis picked up the medical bracelet and handed it to Garrett. I found this in your mother's things, along with some other items you need to see. Garrett examined the bracelet, his brow furrowing. This date, this is months before she told us about the cancer. 8 months before, Ellis confirmed. She knew, Garrett. She knew for 8 months and didn't tell me. She handled consultations alone, made treatment decisions, kept everything secret. He watched comprehension dawn on his son's face. There are letters, Ellis continued. One she wrote to you explaining why she hid it. One to me apologizing. I need to know. Did you receive the letter meant for you? Garrett's face had gone pale. He sat heavily on a stool, the bracelet still in his hand. No, he said quietly. I never got any letter from Mom. I had no idea she'd hidden the diagnosis. Ellis felt something release in his chest. Then you thought I was negligent. You thought I should have known sooner. You were angry at me for failing her when I didn't even know the full truth. Garrett's voice broke. Yes, that's exactly what I thought. God, Dad, I'm so sorry. You didn't know, Ellis said gently. Neither of us did. She protected us both, in different ways. He handed Garrett the letters. His son read through them with shaking hands. When Garrett finished, tears were streaming down his face. She did this because she loved us, Garrett said. But it hurt us anyway. Love and hurt aren't mutually exclusive, Ellis said. Your mother did the best she could with an impossible situation. She made choices that seemed right to her. We just have to figure out how to live with those choices now. They sat together in the quiet hollow, processing revelation and grief, and the strange relief of finally understanding. Outside, birdsong continued. The world kept turning. "What do we do now?" Garrett asked finally. "We move forward," Ellis said. "With the truth, with each other. That's all we can do." Garrett nodded slowly. "Andrea should meet you properly. Not just as the dad who lives in a tree, but as the father I'm finally getting to know again." "I'd like that," Ellis said. They stepped outside together to call Andrea back, and Ellis felt the weight of Margaret's secrets begin to lift. Not disappear, they'd always carry this knowledge now, but transform into something they could bear together. Two men beginning the work of rebuilding their past on a foundation of truth instead of assumptions. Andrea returned from her walk, looking peaceful, her cheeks flushed from the fresh air and exercise. But her expression shifted when she saw both Garrett and Ellis standing outside the tree, their faces marked by recent emotion. "Everything okay?" she asked carefully, her eyes moving between them. "Come inside," Garrett said. "There's something we need to share with you. Something about my mom." They settled into the hollow tree, Andrea sitting beside Garrett on one of the benches Ellis had built, Ellis taking his usual stool across from them. The document still lay spread on the workbench, evidence of Margaret's careful deception. Garrett explained it all, the hidden diagnosis, the 8 months of secret consultations, the letters Margaret had written trying to protect them both. Andrea listened without interrupting, her hand finding Garrett's and holding tight. "She sounds like an incredible woman," Andrea said when Garrett finished. "To carry all that alone, to try to shelter you both from the worst of it, that takes tremendous strength, or tremendous fear," Ellis said quietly. "Maybe both. Definitely both," Andrea agreed. She looked at Ellis directly. "I lost my mother when I was 15. Breast cancer. She told us everything from the beginning, every test result, every prognosis, every treatment option. Sometimes I wished she'd protected us more, given us less to carry. But now, hearing your story, I think maybe there's no right way to handle dying. Everyone just does what they think will hurt their family least." Ellis felt grateful for her presence, for the way she was helping them process this revelation without judgment. She had a calming effect, a maturity beyond her years. "The thing I can't stop thinking about," Garrett said, "is how much time we wasted, Dad and I, barely speaking to each other, both thinking we understood what happened when neither of us had the full story. If Mom had she did what she thought was right," Andrea interrupted gently. "You can't change that now. All you can do is decide what comes next." Garrett looked at his father. "What do you want to come next, Dad?" Ellis thought about the question. What did he want? For months, he'd wanted only to be left alone, to exist in the quiet simplicity of the forest. But that desire had been changing, slowly, since Garrett had found him. "I want to be part of your life," Ellis said finally. "I want to meet Andrea properly, not just as a witness to family revelations. I want to come to your wedding. I want to know what's happening in your world. I want—" His voice caught slightly. "I want to stop hiding." Garrett's eyes filled with tears. "I want that too." Andrea smiled, tears in her own eyes now. "Then let's start fresh. Ellis, tell me about yourself. Not about the tree or Margaret or any of the heavy stuff. Just who are you?" The question caught Ellis off guard. Who was he? He'd defined himself for so long as Margaret's husband, Garrett's father, a carpenter, a widower. But who was he beyond those labels? "I'm someone who works with his hands," Ellis said slowly. "Someone who likes things built solid and true. I'm not great with words, never have been, but I can look at a piece of wood and see what it could become. I like the quiet. I like coffee in the morning and the way the forest sounds just before dawn. I miss my wife every day, but I'm learning that missing her doesn't mean I can't still have a life." "That's beautiful," Andrea said. "What about music? Do you like music?" Ellis smiled slightly. Margaret loved jazz. She'd play it while she cooked, and I'd complain it was too chaotic, too unpredictable. But the truth is, I liked listening to her hum along, made the house feel alive. "Garrett hums when he cooks too," Andrea said. Badly, but enthusiastically. "Hey," Garrett protested, but he was smiling. They talked for over an hour, the conversation gradually shifting from heavy revelation to lighter territory. Andrea told stories about her work as a physical therapist, about the patients who touched her heart. Garrett talked about the bridge project he was overseeing, the challenges of renovation versus new construction. Ellis found himself sharing memories of his carpentry career, of projects he'd been proud of the satisfaction that came from building something that would outlast you. At one point, Andrea noticed the completed chess set on the shelf. "Did you make this?" "Over the winter," Ellis confirmed. "Something to keep my hands busy." "May I look at it?" Ellis nodded, and Andrea carefully picked up pieces one by one, examining each carved figure. When she reached the queen, she studied it for a long moment. "This is Margaret," she said softly. It wasn't a question. "I tried to capture something of her," Ellis admitted. "Not sure I got it quite right." "I think you did," Andrea said. She held the piece out to Garrett. "Look at the eyes. You can see love there." Garrett took the queen piece, turning it in his hands. Ellis watched his son's face, saw recognition there of his mother's features, yes, but also of the care Ellis had put into creating the piece. Proof that he'd been trying to honor her memory, not run from it. "It's beautiful, Dad," Garrett said, his voice thick. "Would you like to have the set?" Ellis asked. "When it's fully complete, I was going to make a box for it, something to protect the pieces." Garrett looked up, surprised. "Really? You'd give it to me?" "I made it for you," Ellis realized as he said it. "I didn't know that while I was carving, but I think I was making it for you all along. Something to remember her by, something to remember this time by." "I'd love that," Garrett said. "Thank you." As afternoon shifted toward evening, Ellis realized something had changed in the hollow tree. It no longer felt like a refuge from the world, but rather like a bridge back to it. A place where he'd done the necessary work of healing enough to rejoin his life, his family, his future. "I've been thinking," Ellis said, as they prepared a simple dinner together, "about what comes next for me. I can't stay here forever. Beverly made that clear, and I'm not sure I want to anymore." "Where would you go?" Garrett asked. "I don't know yet," Ellis admitted. "But maybe somewhere near you, not living with you," he added quickly, seeing Garrett's expression. "I'm not ready for that much togetherness. But close enough to visit, close enough to be part of your lives. Seattle has a lot of carpentry work," Andrea offered. "Good craftsmen are always in demand. I'd have to rebuild my reputation, start from scratch in a new city." "You built a home inside a tree," Garrett pointed out. "I think you can handle building a career in Seattle." Ellis smiled at that. His son had faith in him after everything. That meant more than he could express. They ate dinner as the sun set, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber. Three people who'd started as strangers or estranged family, finding their way towards something new. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but something valuable in its own right. After Andrea and Garrett left that evening, promising to return the next day, Ellis sat by his fire, holding the queen piece from his chess. Set. Margaret's carved face looked back at him, patient and knowing. "I'm going to be okay," he told her memory. "We're going to be okay. I think you'd be happy about that." The fire crackled, the forest breathed, and Ellis Train allowed himself to imagine a future beyond survival. Garrett and Andrea returned the next morning, carrying supplies, fresh coffee, bread, vegetables, even a bottle of wine. "We thought we'd cook one of Mom's recipes," Garrett said. "Andrea wants to learn, and I figured you could teach us both." Ellis felt his throat tighten. "I'd like that." They spread out in the small space, Andrea chopping vegetables at the workbench, while Ellis and Garrett worked at the camp stove. It was cramped, occasionally chaotic, but deeply right. 3 generations of cooking knowledge being passed down. Mum always said the secret to good food was patience, Garrett said, stirring carefully. Never rush the flavors. She learned that the hard way, Ellis said, smiling. First meal she ever cooked for me. She burned the sauce, undercooked the pasta. We ate it anyway, and pretended it was delicious. How long had you been dating? Andrea asked. 2 months. I was already in love with her, but that meal sealed it. Anyone who could laugh at their own disasters was someone I wanted to spend my life with. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the smell of cooking filling the hollow tree. Ellis found himself remembering other meals with Margaret. Those memories didn't hurt quite so much anymore. Dad, Garrett said suddenly, setting down his spoon. I need to say something. About the years before Mom got sick, before everything fell apart. Ellis looked at his son, waiting. I was angry at you long before the cancer diagnosis, Garrett continued. Angry that you worked so much, that you missed games and school events. I know now you were working to provide for us, but back then, I just felt like you were choosing work over family. The words stung, but Ellis recognized the truth in them. You're right. I did work too much. I told myself it was for you and your mother, but I also liked the work. Liked the clear problems with clear solutions. Home was messier, harder to navigate, especially as you got older and I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. Mom tried to bridge that gap, Garrett said. She'd tell me you loved me, that you were just bad at showing it. But neither of us listened to her enough. No, we didn't, Ellis agreed. She was the glue, and when she got sick, we fell apart without her. Andrea had stopped chopping, listening with tears in her eyes. My dad died when I was young, and one thing I learned is that you can't get back lost time. You can only decide what to do with the time you have left. That's what I want to do, Garrett said. Make the most of what's left. Not just show up for big events, but actually know you. I'd like that, Ellis said. But I have to warn you, I'm not very exciting. That's perfect, Garrett said. Because mostly I just work on bridges and argue with contractors. We can be boring together. They all laughed, and the tension released. When the food was ready, they ate together, passing the pot around since Ellis didn't have enough bowls. The stew was good, not exactly like Margaret's, but close enough to evoke home. After lunch, Ellis showed them a project he'd been working on. Using scraps of wood, he'd been building a box for the chess set. I thought I'd line it with felt, Ellis explained. Keep the pieces from rattling. Each one has its own compartment. Garrett ran his hand over the smooth wood. You're really giving this to me? I told you I would. But it's your work, months of carving. Ellis shook his head. I have the memories of making it. That's enough. I want you to have something tangible, something you can pass down someday. He glanced at Andrea. Maybe to your own children. Andrea's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, and Ellis caught the gesture. He looked at Garrett, who was trying to suppress a smile. Is there something you two need to tell me? Ellis asked. Andrea and Garrett exchanged a glance. We weren't going to say anything yet, Andrea said. It's still really early. But yes, I'm pregnant, just 6 weeks. Ellis felt joy surge through him, pure and unexpected. A grandchild? Due in December, Garrett confirmed, if everything goes well. May I? Ellis asked, gesturing toward Andrea. She nodded, and Ellis stepped forward and gently hugged her. Congratulations, both of you. This is wonderful. We wanted to wait until after the wedding to tell people, Garrett said, but we wanted you to know now. Your family. Ellis sat down heavily, overwhelmed. A grandchild. Margaret would never meet this baby, but Ellis would be there. He could be present in a way he hadn't always been for Garrett. I know I wasn't the best father, Ellis said carefully, but I'd like to try to be a better grandfather. We're counting on it. Garrett said. "This kid is going to need someone to teach them carpentry and patience and how to build things that last." "I can do that," Ellis said. "I'd be honored." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about the future, about the wedding in May, about the baby in December, about Ellis's plans to move closer to Seattle, to restart his carpentry business, about holiday visits and Sunday dinners and all the ordinary moments that make up a life. As evening approached and Andrea and Garrett prepared to leave, Ellis walked them to the edge of his camp. The forest was coming alive with spring new growth pushing through old. "Thank you," Ellis said, "for finding me, for not giving up on me, for giving me a reason to come back." "We're family," Garrett said simply. "That's what family does." They embraced, the three of them, standing among the ancient trees. When they separated, Ellis felt lighter than he had in years, not free of grief that would never fully leave, but no longer crushed by it either. He watched them disappear down the trail, Andrea's laughter floating back. Then he turned and looked at his hollow tree, his home for the past months. It had served its purpose. It had given him space to grieve, to heal, to figure out how to keep living. But it was time now to move forward, time to step back into the world and build something new. Ellis went inside and began making plans, not for leaving tomorrow or next week, but for the gradual transition that would take him from isolation back to connection, from survival back to life. The chess set sat on its shelf, complete and waiting for its box. Ellis picked up the queen piece one more time, studying Margaret's carved face. "I'm ready," he told her memory. "I'm ready to live again." And for the first time since she died, Ellis believed it was true. 3 months had passed since that spring afternoon when Garrett and Andrea had shared their news. Ellis stood now, in front of a mirror in a Seattle hotel room, adjusting the tie Andrea had helped him pick out. It had been decades since he'd worn a suit, and the formality felt strange after months of flannel and worn denim. But today was Garrett's wedding. He'd left the hollow tree in late May. Beverly had helped him arrange transportation, and he'd spent several days carefully dismantling the most personal elements. The door he'd given to Beverly for the ranger station, the shelves and furniture he'd left intact, thinking perhaps another lost soul might find shelter there. The transition back to civilization had been harder than expected. The noise, the constant presence of people, the obligations all overwhelming at first. But Garrett and Andrea had been patient, helping him find a small apartment, introducing him to contractors, gradually easing him back into normal life. Ellis had started small repair jobs, his custom furniture pieces. Word had spread about his skill, and now he had enough work to pay rent and rebuild. More importantly, he had time. Time for weekly dinners with Garrett and Andrea, time to attend doctor's appointments, time to simply be present in his son's life. A knock on the door pulled Ellis from his thoughts. Garrett stood there, already dressed in his wedding suit, looking nervous and excited. "Ready?" Garrett asked. "Shouldn't I be asking you that?" Ellis replied with a slight smile. "I've been ready to marry Andrea since our 3rd date," Garrett said, "but I wanted to check on you first." Ellis felt warmth spread through his chest. His son, on his wedding day, checking on him. "I'm good, better than good. I'm honored to be here." They walked together toward the venue, a small garden space that Andrea had loved. "I have something for you," Ellis said. He pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket. "Wedding gift." Garrett unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully crafted, with inlaid designs. When he opened it, he found 2 hand-carved napkin rings inscribed with his and Andrea's initials. "Dad, these are beautiful. For your first dinner in your new home," Ellis explained. "Your mother always said that breaking bread together was what made a house a home." Garrett pulled his father into an embrace, and Ellis held on tight, grateful beyond words for this second chance. The ceremony was simple and lovely. Andrea wore a cream-colored dress that accommodated her growing belly, now visible at 5 months. She glowed with happiness. When it came time for Garrett to walk forward, he turned to Ellis, extending his hand. Together, father and son walked to where Andrea waited, and Ellis felt Margaret's presence like a benediction. The reception was small, maybe 40 people held in the same garden space. Ellis found himself talking easily with other guests, no longer isolated but simply a father celebrating his son's marriage. He danced with Andrea, who laughed and told him he was better at it than Garrett. He listened to toasts and stories, learning things about his son's life he'd never known. As evening fell, Garrett found Ellis sitting on a bench, watching the celebration with a contented smile. "Thank you for being here," Garrett said, sitting beside him. "I wouldn't have missed it for anything." "I keep thinking about Mom," Garrett admitted, wishing she could see this. "She can see it," Ellis said quietly. "Maybe not literally, but she's here in the way you love Andrea, in the way you're building your life together. All the good things she taught you, those don't disappear." Garrett was quiet. "I'm glad we found each other again, Dad." "Me too, son." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as Andrea danced with her father. "I finished the box for the chess set," Ellis said eventually. "I'll bring it by next week." "I'd like that." "Maybe we could play a game?" "I'd like that too." 2 months later, Ellis stood in a hospital room, holding his granddaughter for the first time. She was tiny, perfect, with a shock of dark hair. "Her name is Margaret," Andrea said from the bed. "Margaret Ellis. We hope that's okay." Ellis couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed. His wife's name, his name, carried forward. "It's more than okay," he managed finally. "It's perfect." Garrett stood beside him, one hand on his father's shoulder. "Think you can teach her carpentry when she's older?" "I'll teach her everything I know," Ellis promised. He looked down at baby Margaret, at this small, perfect life that represented so much hope. She would never know the grandmother she was named for, but Ellis would tell her stories. "Your grandmother would have loved you," he whispered. "She would have loved you so much." That winter, on the anniversary of Margaret's death, Ellis returned to the hollow tree for one final visit. Beverly had agreed to guide him. The tree stood unchanged, eternal and patient. Someone had left flowers at the base. Ellis added his own offering, a photograph of baby Margaret, wrapped in waterproof plastic and tucked into the bark. "I wanted you to see her," Ellis said to the tree, to the forest, to Margaret's memory. "Wanted you to know that life goes on, that we're going to be okay." The forest answered with wind through branches and distant birdsong. Ellis stood for a long time, remembering everything that had happened here. Then he turned and walked back toward the trailhead, where Beverly waited to drive him back to his apartment, his work, his son's family, back to a life that would never be what he'd planned but had become something valuable in its own right. The hollow tree remained behind, empty but not forgotten, a testament to survival, to the human capacity for rebuilding, to the possibility of starting over when everything seems lost. And Ellis Train, carpenter and father and grandfather, walked forward into whatever came next, carrying his grief and his joy with equal grace, knowing that both were necessary, both were real, both were part of the complicated, beautiful work of being alive.